This is Audible.
The Institute for Advanced Consciousness and Spiritual Research presents Power versus Force, an Anatomy of Consciousness, the Hidden Determinants of Human Behavior. Read by the author, Dr. David R. Hawkins.
The skillful are not obvious. In fact, they appear to be simple-minded. Those who know this know the patterns of the Absolute. To know the patterns is the subtle power. The subtle power moves all things and has no name.
Foreword. Written by E. Whalen. Editor, Bard Press. Arizona, 1995. Imagine. What if you had access to a simple yes or no answer to any question you wish to ask? A demonstrably true answer. Any question. Think about it. There's the obvious. Jane is seeing another guy. Yes. No. Johnny is telling the truth about school. Yes. No. But it's only a short step to, this is a safe investment. Yes. No. Or this career is worthy of my pursuit. Yes. No. What if everyone had such access? Staggering implications suggest themselves immediately. Think again. What would happen to our ponderous and all too often flawed judicial system if there were a clear, confirmable answer to the proposition, John Doe is guilty as charged? Yes? No? What would happen to politics as we know it if all of us could ask the question, Candidate X honestly intends to fulfill this campaign promise? Yes? No? And all of us got the same answer? And what would happen to advertising, period? You get the idea. But the idea gets bigger fast. What happens to nationalism? Nation X is in fact dedicated to the overthrow of democracy. To government. This bill does in fact protect the rights of citizens. What happens to, the check is in the mail? If, as has been said, man learned to lie an hour after he learned to talk, then a phenomenon such as we are discussing would be the genesis of the most fundamental change in human knowledge since the beginning of society. The transformations it would wreak in fields from communications to ethics, in our most basic concepts, in every detail of daily existence, would be so profound that it is difficult even to conceive what life would be like in a subsequent new era of truth. The world as we know it would be irrevocably changed to its very roots. The study of kinesiology, which is the study of muscles and their movements, especially as applied to physical conditioning, first received scientific attention in the second half of this century through the work of Dr. George Goodhart, who pioneered the specialty he called applied kinesiology after finding that benign physical stimuli, for instance, beneficial nutritional supplements, would increase the strength of certain indicator muscles, whereas inimical stimuli would cause those muscles to suddenly weaken. The implication was that at a level far below conceptual consciousness, the body knew, and through muscle testing was able to signal what was good and bad for it. The classic example, cited later in this work, is a universally observed weakening of indicator muscles in the presence of a chemical sweetener. The same muscles strengthen in the presence of a healthful, natural supplement. In the late 70s, Dr. John Diamond refined this specialty into a new discipline he called behavioral kinesiology. Dr. Diamond's startling discovery was that indicator muscles would strengthen or weaken in the presence of positive or negative emotional and intellectual stimuli, as well as physical stimuli. A smile will make you test strong. The statement, I hate you, will make you test weak. Before we go any farther, let us explain in detail exactly how one tests, especially as the listener will certainly wish to try this himself. Here is Dr. Diamond's outline from his 1979 book, Your Body Doesn't Lie, of the procedure adapted by him from the classic description in H.O. Kendall's Muscles, Testing and Function. It takes two people to perform a kinesiological test. Choose a friend or family member for testing. We'll call him or her your subject. 1. Have the subject stand erect, right arm relaxed at his side, left arm held out parallel to the floor, elbow straight. You may use the other arm if you wish. 2. Face your subject and place your left hand on his right shoulder to steady him. Then place your right hand on the subject's extended left arm just above the wrist. 3. Tell the subject you are going to push his arm down as he resists with all his strength. 4. Now push down on his arm fairly quickly, firmly, and evenly. The idea is to push just hard enough to test the spring and bounce in the arm, not so hard that the muscle becomes fatigued. It is not a question of who is stronger, but of whether the muscle can lock the shoulder joint against the push. Assuming there is no physical problem with the muscle and the subject is in a normal, relaxed state of mind, receiving no extraneous stimuli. For this reason, it is important that the tester not smile or otherwise interact with the subject. The muscle will test strong. The arm will remain locked. If the test is repeated in the presence of a negative stimulus, for instance, artificial sweetener, although you are pushing down no harder than before, the muscle will not be able to resist the pressure, and the subject's arm will fall to his side. A striking aspect of Diamond's research was the uniformity of response among his subjects. Diamond's results were predictable, repeatable, universal. This was so even where no rational link existed between stimulus and response. For totally undetermined reasons, certain abstract symbols caused all subjects to test weak, others the opposite. Some results were perplexing. Certain pictures, with no overtly positive or negative content, would cause all subjects to test weak, while other neutral pictures caused all subjects to test strong. And some results were food for considerable surmise. Whereas virtually all classical music and most pop music, including classic rock and roll, caused a universally strong response, the hard or metal rock that first gained popularity in the late 70s produced a universally weak response. There was one other phenomenon that Diamond noted in passing, though devoting no deeper analysis to its extraordinary implications. Subjects listening to tapes of known deceits, Lyndon Johnson perpetrating the Tonkin Gulf hoax, Edward Kennedy stonewalling the Chappaquiddick incident, universally tested weak. While listening to recordings of demonstrably true statements, they universally tested strong. This was the starting point of the work of the author of this volume, the well-known psychiatrist and physician David R. Hawkins. In 1975, Dr. Hawkins began research on the kinesiological response to truth and falsehood. It had been established that test subjects did not need any conscious acquaintance with the substance or issue being tested. In double-blind studies and in mass demonstrations involving entire lecture audiences, subjects universally tested weak in response to unmarked envelopes containing artificial sweetener and strong to identical placebo envelopes. The same naive response appeared in testing intellectual values. What seems to be at work is a form of communal consciousness, spiritus mundi, or as Hawkins calls it following Jung, a database of consciousness. The phenomenon, seen so commonly in other social animals, whereby a fish swimming at one edge of a school will turn instantaneously when its fellows a quarter-mile away flee a predator, pertains in some subconscious way to our species also. There are simply too many documented instances of individuals having intimate acquaintance with information experienced firsthand by remote strangers for us to deny that there are forms of shared knowledge other than those achieved by rational consciousness. or perhaps, more simply, the same spark of inner sub-rational wisdom that can discriminate healthy from unhealthy, can discriminate true from false. One highly suggestive element of this phenomenon is the binary nature of the response. Hawkins found that questions must be phrased so that the answer is very clearly yes or no, like a nerve synapse that is on or off, like the most basic cellular forms of knowledge. Like so much of what our cutting-edge physicists tell us is the essential nature of universal energy. Is the human brain at some primal level a wondrous computer linked with a universal energy field that knows far more than it knows? Be that as it may. As Dr. Hawkins' research continued, his most fertile discovery was a means of calibrating a scale of relative truth by which intellectual positions, statements, or ideologies could be rated on a range of 1 to 1,000. One can ask, this item, book, philosophy, teacher, calibrates at 200. Yes, no. At 250. Yes, no. And so on, until the point of common weak response determines the calibration. The enormous implication of these calibrations was that for the first time in human history, ideological validity could be appraised as an innate quality in any subject. Through 20 years of similar calibrations, Hawkins was able to analyze the full spectrum of the levels of human consciousness, developing a fascinating map of the geography of man's experience. This anatomy of consciousness produces a profile of the entire human condition, allowing a comprehensive analysis of the emotional and spiritual development of individuals, societies, and the race in general. So profound and far-reaching a view provides not only a new understanding of man's journey in the universe, but also a guide to all of us as to where we and our neighbors are on the ladder of spiritual enlightenment and on our own personal journeys to become who we could be. In this volume, Dr. Hawkins brings these fruits of decades of research and insight into the penetrating illumination of revolutionary discoveries in advanced particle physics and nonlinear dynamics. For the first time in our Western intellectual record, he shows the cold light of science is confirming what mystics and saints have always said about the self, God, and the very nature of reality. This vision of being, essence, and divinity presents a picture of man's relation to the universe that is unique in its capacity to satisfy both soul and reason. There is a rich intellectual and spiritual harvest here, much that you can take and much more that you can give yourself. Continue listening. The future starts now. Preface.
To explain that which is simple can be difficult indeed. Much of this book is devoted to the process of making the simple obvious. If we can understand even one simple thing in depth, we will have greatly expanded our capacity for comprehending the nature of the universe and of life itself. Kinesiology is now a well-established science based on testing of an all or none muscle response to stimuli. A positive stimulus provokes a strong muscle response. A negative stimulus results in a demonstrable weakening of the test muscle. Clinical kinesiologic muscle testing has found widespread verification over the last 25 years. Goodhart's original research on the subject was given wider application by Dr. John Diamond, whose books brought the subject to the public. Diamond determined that this positive or negative response occurs with stimuli, both physical and mental. The research reflected in this volume has taken Dr. Diamond's technique several steps further through the discovery that this kinesiologic response reflects the capacity of the human organism to differentiate not only positive from negative stimuli, but also anabolic, meaning life-enhancing, from catabolic, meaning life-consuming, and most dramatically, true from false. The test itself is simple, rapid, and relatively foolproof. A positive muscle reaction occurs in response to a statement which is objectively true. A negative response occurs if the test subject is presented with a false statement. This phenomenon occurs independently of the test subject's own opinion or knowledge of the topic, and the response has proven cross-culturally valid in many populations and consistent throughout time. The test results thus fulfill the scientific requirement of replication and therefore reliable verification by other investigators. This technique provides, for the first time in human history, an objective basis for distinguishing truth from falsehood, which is totally verifiable across time with randomly selected naive test subjects. Moreover, we found that this testable phenomenon can be used to calibrate human levels of consciousness so that an arbitrary logarithmic scale of whole numbers emerges, stratifying the relative power of levels of consciousness in all areas of human experience. Exhaustive investigation has resulted in a calibrated scale of consciousness in which the log of whole numbers from 1 to 1,000 calibrates the degree of power of all possible levels of human awareness. The millions of calibrations which confirm this discovery further disclose the stratification of levels of power in human affairs, revealing a remarkable distinction between power and force and their respective qualities. This in turn led to a comprehensive reinterpretation of human behavior in order to identify the invisible energy fields that control it. The calibrated scale was found to coincide with sub-levels of the hierarchy of the perennial philosophy, correlations with emotional and intellectual phenomena in sociology, clinical psychology, psychoanalysis, and traditional spirituality, which immediately suggested themselves. The calibrated scale has been examined here in light of current discoveries in advanced theoretical physics and the nonlinear dynamics of chaos theory. Calibrated levels, we suggest, represent powerful attractor fields within the domain of consciousness itself that dominate human existence and therefore define content, meaning, and value, and serve as organizing energies for widespread patterns of human behavior. This stratification of attractor fields according to corresponding levels of consciousness provides a new paradigm for recontextualizing the human experience throughout all time. Practically, by accessing data to which there has been heretofore no avenue of approach, our method promises both great value in researching history and enormous possible benefit for man's future. In attempting to emphasize the value of this technique as a research tool, examples have been given of its potential uses in the wide range of human activities, such as in art, history, commerce, politics, medicine, sociology, the natural sciences, and pragmatically in marketing, advertising, research and development, and empirically in psychological, philosophic, and religious spiritual inquiry. Specific applications have been suggested in such diverse fields as criminology, intelligence, addictionology, and the whole field of self-improvement. But further uses and extrapolations of the research method detailed have been barely hinted at. Although the results described here are the product of 20 years of investigation and literally millions of calibrations on thousands of subjects by teams of investigators, this book represents only a beginning exploration of the method's potential to enhance our knowledge in all the arts and sciences. Perhaps most important is its promise as an aid in spiritual growth and maturation to the most advanced levels of consciousness, even enlightenment itself. By use of the kinesiologic testing procedure described herein, unlimited information about any subject, past or present, is universally available. But the realization that everything is knowable about anything or anyone, anywhere, at any point in time, creates at first a paradigm shock. This reaction arises generally from realization of the non-locality, impersonality, and universality of consciousness itself, and, specifically, from the realization of the observability of one's own thoughts and motivations and their transparency across time. That one's every thought and action leave an indelible trace forever in the universe can be an unsettling thought. As in the case of the discovery of radio waves or X-rays, a sudden expansion of our awareness of the workings of the universe not only allows but demands a recontextualization of our worldview. Implications of new knowledge require a reworking of old ideas to form a larger context. Though it may occasion some intellectual stress, such scientific recontextualization of human behavior can expose the basic structures that underlie personal and social problems, thereby revealing their potential solutions. Because this subject matter is in fact extraordinarily simple, it is difficult to present in a world enamored of complexity. Despite our mistrust of simplification, we may see two general classes of people in the world, believers and non-believers. To the non-believers, everything is false until proven true. To the believers, everything said in good faith is probably true, unless it is proven false. The pessimistic position of cynical skepticism stems from fear. The more optimistic manner of accepting information arises from self-confidence. Either style works, and each has its pros and cons. I have been faced, therefore, with the problem of presenting the data in a manner that will satisfy both approaches. This book is therefore oxymoronic in style, written to facilitate both so-called left and right brain comprehension. In actuality, we know things by a holistic pattern recognition. The easiest way to grasp a whole new concept is simply by familiarity. This kind of understanding is encouraged by a style of writing characterized as closure. Instead of using only sparse adjectives or examples to express thoughts, they are instead run out and completed by use of repetition. The concept is then done, and the mind is left at ease. Such an approach is also desirable because the mind that reads Chapter 3 will not be the same as the mind that reads Chapter 1. For that matter, the idea of having to start from Chapter 1 and read progressively to the end is merely a fixed left-brain concept. This is the pedestrian path of Newtonian physics, based on a limited and limiting view of the world, in which all events supposedly happen in a sequence A causes B causes C. This form of myopia arises from an outdated paradigm of reality. Our wider and far more comprehensive view draws not only upon the essence of the most advanced physics, mathematics, and nonlinear theory, but as well upon intuitions that can be experientially validated by anyone. In general, the challenge in presenting this material lies in the paradox of comprehending nonlinear concepts in a linear sentence-by-sentence structure. The fields of science from which the data emerged are of themselves complex and difficult enough, such as advanced theoretical physics and the mathematics thereof, nonlinear dynamics, chaos theory and its mathematics, advanced behavioral kinesiology, neurobiology, turbulence theory, as well as the philosophic considerations of epistemology and ontology. Beyond this, it was necessary to address the nature of human consciousness itself, an uncharted area at the perimeter of which the sciences have all drawn back. To conclusively comprehend such subjects from a purely intellectual viewpoint would be a staggering enterprise requiring a lifetime of study. Instead of essaying so formidable a task, I have tried to extract the essence of each subject and work only with these essences. Even a rudimentary attempt to explain the workings of the testing technique fundamental to this book, which seems initially to transcend known laws of the universe, inevitably leads us into the intellectual territories of advanced theoretical physics, nonlinear dynamics, and chaos theory. I have therefore attempted as much as possible to present these subjects in non-technical terms. There is no need to worry that some erudite intellectual capacity is required to digest this material. It is not. We will circle around the same concepts over and over until they are obvious. Each time we return to comment on an example, greater comprehension will occur. This kind of learning is like surveying new terrain in an airplane. On the first pass, it all looks unfamiliar. The second time around, we spot some points of reference. The third time, it starts to make sense. And we finally gain familiarity through simple exposure. The inborn pattern recognition mechanism of the mind takes care of the rest. To quell my own fear that perhaps, despite my best efforts, the reader might not get the essential message of the study, I will spell it out in advance. The individual human mind is like a computer terminal connected to a giant database. The database is human consciousness itself, of which our own consciousness is merely an individual expression, but with its roots in the common consciousness of all of mankind. This database is the realm of genius. Because to be human is to participate in the database, everyone by virtue of his birth has access to genius. The unlimited information contained in the database has now been shown to be readily available to anyone in a few seconds, at any time, and in any place. This is indeed an astonishing discovery, bearing the power to change lives, both individually and collectively, to a degree never yet anticipated. The database transcends time and space and all limitations of individual consciousness. This distinguishes it as a unique tool for future research and opens as yet undreamed of areas for possible investigation. It holds forth the prospect of the establishment of an objective basis for human values, behaviors, and belief systems. The information obtained by this method reveals a new context for understanding human behavior and a new paradigm for validating objective truth. Because the technique itself can be used by integrous people anywhere at any time, it has the capacity to initiate a new era of human experience based on observable and verifiable truth. We have at our fingertips a means of accurately distinguishing truth from falsehood, workable from unworkable, benevolent from malign. We can illuminate the hidden forces hitherto overlooked that determine human behavior. We have at our disposal a means of finding answers to previously unresolvable personal and social problems. Falsehood need no longer hold sway over our lives. We might add, which is not in the original book, that subsequent research indicated that only people who themselves calibrate 200 or over are able to obtain accurate test results. Although the subject matter has proven easy to teach in lecture or videotapes, my problem has been to work it into readable form. The proofs can be complex. The demonstrations, however, are ultra-simple. Children get it right away and follow through with delight. There's nothing that is surprising to them. They have always known they were connected to the database, and we adults have merely forgotten it. The inherent genius of the child is close to the surface, which is why it was children who saw that the emperor was not wearing new clothes. Genius is like that. I will have been successful if by the end of the book you exclaim, "Oh, I always knew that." What is contained herein is only a reflection of that which you already know, but don't know that you know. All I have hoped to do here is connect the dots to let the hidden picture emerge. This book makes a huge promise, perhaps the biggest promise that has ever been made to you. It can provide you the means by which you may detect if you are being misled. Therefore, you never need read a book or buy into any major teaching again without testing it first. It's too dangerous and too costly. The level of truth of this work itself has been calibrated at 750, which is unusually high for this time in this culture. I pray that this is already a partial fulfillment of the promise. My hope as author has been that this work might undo the very sources of pain, suffering, and failure, and assist the evolution of human consciousness in each of us to rise to the level of joy that should be the essence of man's experience. The work presented by this book began in January 1965. It was finally finished in June 1994. Much of the material was originally developed in the course of work on a doctoral dissertation. The findings reported in the study were independently derived by the use of the research tool elucidated herein, the kinesiologic response. The work evolved spontaneously with reference to outside sources of information. Correlation with the work of others was incorporated at a later date to provide an intellectual frame of reference. Much of the work in this study has now been corroborated by worldwide research presented in independent studies, such as the first major conference on consciousness, entitled Towards a Scientific Basis for Consciousness, which was held at the University of Arizona Health Sciences Center, Tucson, Arizona, in April of 1994. Our research teams used the testing method described in the book to calibrate the levels of truth of every chapter, paragraph, and sentence. For instance, testing revealed an error in a list of celebrities who were destroyed themselves as a consequence of their fame. When we checked each word, the name John Lennon was found to be in error. In fact, he was shot by an assassin. When his name was deleted, the level of truth of the sentence, and therefore the paragraph on the page, rose to match that of the rest of the chapter. Preliminary versions of the book were circulated among selected readers, from rank-and-file healthcare workers to heads of state such as Mikhail Gorbachev, Nobel winners. Some comments appear on the back cover. Each person's response to the presentation of this subject has been unique. One interesting fact observed was that the scores of tested individuals increased after encountering the material. It appears that mere exposure to the data raised the subject's level of consciousness. Because the implications and practical applications of the work are so varied, and any aspect of the material can be expanded and focused to suit the interests of a given audience, portions of it have lent themselves clinically to presentations for various special interest groups. A segment of the material was presented by the author in the keynote speech at the first International Conference on Consciousness and Addictions in San Mateo, California, and in summation was published in the Proceedings of that conference by the Brookridge Institute in the book Beyond Addictions, Beyond Boundaries. An expanded version was given in a 4-hour videotaped lecture on consciousness and addictions at the Second National Conference on Consciousness and Addictions in San Francisco in 1987. Other parts of the material have appeared in previous series of nationally published videotapes, such as Handling Major Crisis, Cardiovascular and Heart Disease, Depression, Alcoholism, Spiritual First Aid, The Aging Process, Pain and Suffering, Weight, Worry, Fear and Anxiety, Health, Illness, Special Relationships, and Sexuality. Some of this material was presented during 3-hour weekly lectures given in an alcohol and drug rehab center over a 5-year period at the Sedona Villa of Camelback Hospital. This is the first time the anatomy of consciousness itself has been delineated in pure form in its entirety, without attenuation to the interests of a specific special interest audience. Written at the Institute for Advanced Theoretical Research in 1995.
Introduction.
All human endeavor has the common unstated goal of understanding or influencing human experience. To this end, man has developed numerous descriptive and analytic disciplines, such as morality, philosophy, psychology, and so forth. Staggering amounts of time and money are invested in data collection and analysis in attempts to predict human trends. Implicit in this frenetic search is the expectation of finding some ultimate answer. The answer we seem perennially to believe will, once found, allow us to solve the problems of the economy or crime, national health or politics, etc. But so far, we have solved none. It isn't that we lack data. We are virtually drowning in data. The obstacle is that we do not have the proper tools to interpret the significance of our data. We have not yet asked the right questions because we have not had an adequate gauge of our questions' relevance or accuracy. Man's dilemma, now and always, has been that he misidentifies his own intellectual artifacts as reality. But these artificial suppositions are merely the products of an arbitrary point of perception. The inadequacy of the answers we receive is a direct consequence of the limitations implicit in the viewpoints of the questioner. Slight errors in the formation of questions result in gross errors in the answers that follow. Understanding does not proceed simply from examining data. It comes from examining data in a particular context. Data is useless until we know what it means. To understand its meaning, we need not only to ask the right questions, but we also need the appropriate instruments with which to measure the data in a meaningful process of sorting and description. Most of human behavior has remained indecipherable despite all attempts to understand it in depth. The systems we have created to achieve understanding may seem extensive and impressive, but each in turn has led us down a blind alley because of limitations inherent in the original design. As we explore the nature of man's problems, it becomes clear that there has never been a reliable experimental yardstick with which to measure and interpret man's motivations and experiences over the course of history. Philosophy in all of its branches attempts to comprehend human experience by creating abstractions and hypothecating their concordance with some ultimate reality. Political systems are all based on suppositions about relative human values, lacking any demonstrable factual basis. All systems of morality resolve into arbitrary attempts to reduce the enormous complexity of human behavior to simplistic categories of right or wrong. Psychoanalysis, in exposing the unconscious mind, has compounded this model, giving rise to a bewildering array of treatments and psychologies derived from various viewpoints. This ongoing babble of man's attempt to understand himself finally produces a semantic morass in which, in the end, anything one might say is probably true to some degree. Because of uncertainty about the exact nature of causality, even when measurable results are obtained, they are subject to being ascribed to fictitious causes. The fatal fault of all thought systems has been primarily, number one, failure to differentiate between subjective and objective. Number two, disregard of the limitation of context inherent in basic design and terminology. 3, ignorance of the nature of consciousness itself. And 4, misunderstanding of the nature of causality. The consequences of these shortcomings will become obvious as we explore the major areas of human experience from a new perspective with new tools. Society constantly expends its efforts to correct effects instead of causes, which is one reason why the evolution of human consciousness proceeds so slowly. Mankind is really barely on the first rung of the ladder. We haven't yet solved even such primitive problems as world hunger. The accomplishments of mankind thus far, in fact, are most impressive for having been achieved almost blindly through trial and error. While this random search for solutions has resulted in a maze of baffling complexity, true answers always have the hallmark of simplicity. The basic law of the universe is economy. The universe does not waste a single quark. All serves a purpose and fits into a balance. There are no extraneous events. Man is stuck with his lack of knowledge about himself until he can learn to look beyond apparent causes. From the human record, we may note that answers never arise from identifying so-called causes in the world. Instead, it is necessary to identify the conditions that underlie these ostensible causes, and these conditions exist only within man's consciousness itself. No definitive answer to any problem can be found by isolating sequences of events and projecting upon them a mental notation called causality. There are no actual causes within the observable world. As we shall demonstrate, the observable world is a world of effects. What is the human prognosis? Is society, by virtue of its own chaotic subsystems, a runaway juggernaut inherently doomed? This prospect underlies a general social apprehension about the future. International polls indicate a high level of unhappiness everywhere on the globe, even in the most advanced countries. While the majority resign themselves to a pessimistic view and pray for a better life in the hereafter, the few visionaries who foresee a utopian future are unable to describe the means necessary to bring it about. Society needs visionaries of means, not dreamers of ends. Once we have the means, the ends will reveal themselves. The difficulty in finding effective means reduces itself, upon examination, to be our inability to discriminate the essential from the non-essential. Thus far, there has been no system offering a method by which to distinguish powerful and effective solutions from weak, ineffective ones. Our means of evaluation themselves have been inherently incapable of performing realistic appraisal. Societal choices, more often than not, are the result of expediency, statistical fallacy, sentiment, political or media pressure, or personal prejudice and vested interest. Crucial decisions affecting the lives of everyone on the planet are made under conditions that virtually guarantee failure. Because societies lack the necessary reality base for formulation of effective problem resolutions, they fall back over and over on a resort to force in its various expressions, such as law, taxation, war, rules, regulations, etc., which is extremely costly, instead of employing power, which is very economical. Man has two basic types of operational faculties, reason and feeling. Both are inherently unreliable, as history of precarious individual and collective survival attests. Although we ascribe our actions to reason, in fact, man operates primarily out of pattern recognition. The logical arrangement of data serves mainly to enhance a pattern recognition system, which then becomes so-called truth. But nothing is ever actually true except under certain circumstances, and then only from a particular viewpoint, characteristically unstated. As a result, thoughtful man deduces that all his problems arise from the difficulty of knowingness. Ultimately, the mind arrives at epistemology, which is that branch of philosophy which examines the question of how and to what degree man really knows anything. Such philosophic discussions may either seem erudite or irrelevant, but the questions they pose are at the very core of human experience. No matter where we start in an examination of human knowledge, we always end up looking at the phenomena of awareness and the nature of human consciousness, and we eventually come to the same realization. Any further advance in man's condition requires a verifiable basis of knowingness upon which we may place our trust. The main obstacle to man's development, then, is the lack of knowledge about the nature of consciousness itself. If we look within ourselves at the instant-by-instant processes of our minds, we will soon notice that the mind acts much more rapidly than we would acknowledge. It becomes apparent that the notion that our actions are based on thoughtful decisions is a grand illusion. The decision-making process is a function of consciousness itself. With enormous rapidity, the mind makes choices based on millions of pieces of data and their correlations and projections far beyond conscious comprehension. This is a global function dominated by the energy patterns, which the new science of nonlinear dynamics terms attractors. Consciousness automatically chooses what it deems best from instant to instant, because that is ultimately the only function of which it is really capable. The relative weight and merit given to certain data are determined by a predominant attractor pattern operating in the individual or in a collective group of minds. These patterns can be identified, described, and calibrated. Out of that information arises a totally new understanding of human behavior, history, and the potential destiny of mankind. The present volume, the result of 20 years of intensive research involving millions of calibrations, can make such understanding available to anyone. That this revelation proceeds from a fortuitous connection between the physiology of consciousness, the function of the human nervous system, and the physics of the universe is not surprising when we remind ourselves that we are, after all, part of a universe in which everything is connected to everything else. All its secrets are thus, theoretically at least, available to us if we know where and how to look. Can man lift himself up by his bootstraps? Why not? All he has to do is increase his buoyancy, and he will effortlessly rise to a higher state. Force cannot accomplish that feat. Power not only can, but constantly does. Man thinks he lives by virtue of the forces he can control, but in fact he is governed by power from unrevealed sources, power over which he has no control. Because power is effortless, it goes unseen and unsuspected. Force is experienced through the senses. Power can be recognized only through inner awareness. Man is immobilized by his present condition, by his alignment with enormously powerful attractor energy patterns, which he himself unconsciously sets in motion. Moment by moment, he is suspended in this state of evolution, restrained by the energies of force, impelled by the energies of power. The individual is thus like a cork in the sea of consciousness. He doesn't know where he is, where he came from, where he is going, and he doesn't know why. Man wanders about in this endless conundrum, asking the same questions century after century, and so he will continue, failing a quantum leap in consciousness. One mark of such a sudden expansion of context and understanding is an inner experience of relief, joy, and awe. All who have had such an experience feel afterwards that the universe has granted them a precious gift. Facts are accumulated by effort, but truth reveals itself effortlessly. Hopefully, through this book, the reader can comprehend and then prepare the conditions for such a personal revelation. To do so is the ultimate adventure.
Part 1. Tools. Chapter 1. Critical Advances in Knowledge.
The evolution of this work, which began in 1965, was fostered by developments in numerous scientific fields, of which 3 were of special importance: clinical research on the physiology of the nervous system and the holistic functioning of the human organism resulted in the development in the 1970s of the new science of kinesiology. Meanwhile, in the technical arena, computers were being designed that were capable of millions of calculations in milliseconds, making possible the new tools of artificial intelligence. This abrupt access to formerly inconceivable masses of data begot a revolutionary perspective on natural phenomena, chaos theory. Simultaneously, in the theoretical sciences, quantum mechanics led to advanced theoretical physics. Through associated mathematics, there emerged a whole new study of nonlinear dynamics, one of the most far-reaching developments of modern science, the long-term impact of which has yet to be realized. Kinesiology for the first time exposed the intimate connection between mind and body, revealing that the mind thinks with the body itself. Thence, it provided an avenue for the exploration of the ways consciousness reveals itself in the subtle mechanisms behind disease processes. Advanced computers permitting the depiction through graphics of vast amounts of data disclosed unsuspected systems within what had been ignored by Newtonian physics as indecipherable or meaningless chaotic data. Theoreticians in diverse fields were suddenly able to intimate coherent ways of understanding that had been considered incoherent or nonlinear, diffuse, or chaotic, and therefore inaccessible through conventional, probabilistic logical theory and mathematics. Analysis of this seemingly incoherent data identified hidden energy patterns or attractors, which had been postulated by the advanced mathematics of nonlinear equations, and these existed behind apparently random natural phenomena. Computer graphics clearly demonstrated the designs of these attractor fields. The implicit potential for analyzing supposedly unpredictable systems in such disparate areas as fluid mechanics, human biology, and stellar astronomy appeared to be limitless. The public, however, had remained generally unaware of this new field of nonlinear dynamics, except for the appearance in the marketplace of some intriguing new computer graphics generated by fractal geometry. During the era preceding these revelations, however, linear science had grown progressively divorced from concern with the basis of life itself. All life processes are, in fact, nonlinear. This isolation was also characteristic of medicine, which, when presented with the amazing discoveries of kinesiology, merely ignored the information because it had no context, no paradigm of reality with which to comprehend it. Medicine had forgotten that it was an art and that science was merely a tool of that art. Within medicine, psychiatry had always been held at a distance by the traditionalists because it dealt with the immeasurables of human life, and therefore appeared less seemingly scientific from the Newtonian viewpoint. Academic psychiatry, in fact, has made major scientific breakthroughs in psychopharmacology since at least the 1950s. However, it remains the most nonlinear area of medicine, examining such subjects as intuition, decision-making, and the whole phenomena of life as process. Although in the academic psychiatric literature there is little mention of such things as love, meaning, value, or will, the psychiatric discipline at least essays a somewhat larger view of man than other traditional medical fields. Regardless of what branch of inquiry one starts from, whether it is philosophy, political theory, theology, etc., all avenues of investigation eventually converge at a common meeting point, the quest for an organized understanding of the nature of pure consciousness. But all of the major enterprises in human knowledge discussed, even kinesiology and nonlinear dynamics, halted at this last great barrier to human knowledge, the investigation of the nature of consciousness itself. Some advanced thinkers, it is true, went beyond the parameters of their respective fields and began to ask questions about the relationship between the universe, science, and consciousness in its experience as mind. We will refer to their theories and their impact on the advance of human understanding as we proceed. The thesis of the present work derives from amalgamating these several scientific disciplines into a methodology both elegantly simple and rewarding. We have found thereby that consciousness can indeed be investigated. Although no roadmaps for such a study have thus far been available, research into the subject has produced its own design, and with it the context needed to comprehend its findings. Inasmuch as everything in the universe is connected with everything else, it is not surprising that one of the primary objectives of this study, a map of the energy fields of consciousness, would correlate with and be corroborated by all other avenues of investigation, and thereby uniting the diversity of human experience and its expressions in an all-encompassing paradigm. Such an insight can bypass the artificial dichotomy between subject and object, transcending the limited viewpoint that creates the illusion of duality. The subjective and objective are in fact one and the same, as can be demonstrated without resort to nonlinear equations or computer graphics. Although no roadmaps for such a study have thus far been available, research into the subject has produced its own design, and with it, the context needed to comprehend its own findings. By identifying subjective and objective as the same, we are able to transcend the constraints of the concept of time, which by its very definition is a major hindrance to comprehension of the nature of life, especially in its expression as human experience. If in actuality the so-called subjective and objective are really one and the same, then we can find the answers to all questions by merely looking within man himself. By simply recording observations, we can see a grand picture emerge, one that predicates no limitations to the extent of further investigation. All of us have available to us at all times a computer, far more advanced than the most elaborate artificial intelligence machine, the human mind itself. The basic function of any measuring device is simply to give a signal indicating the detection by the instrument of a slight change. In the experiments to be described, the reactions of the human body itself provide such a signal of change in conditions. As will be seen, the body can discern to the finest degree the difference between that which is supportive of life and that which is not. We should not be surprised at this. Living things all react to what is life supportive and what is not. This is the fundamental mechanism of survival. Inherent in all life forms is the capacity to detect change and react correctively. Thus, trees become smaller at higher elevations as the oxygen in the atmosphere becomes scarcer. Human protoplasm is far more sensitive than that of a tree. The methodology proceeding from the study of nonlinear dynamics which we employed in this work of developing a map of the fields of human consciousness is known as attractor research. It is concerned with the identification of power ranges of energy fields utilizing critical point analysis. Critical point analysis is a technique derived from the fact that in any highly complex system, there is a specific critical point at which the smallest input will result in the greatest change. The great gears of a windmill can be halted by lightly touching the right escape mechanism. It is possible to paralyze a giant locomotive if you know exactly where to put your finger. Nonlinear dynamics enables these significant patterns to be identified in complex presentations, even when they are obscured by incoherence or sheer mass of indecipherable data. It discovers the relevance in what the world discards as irrelevant. Using an entirely different approach and totally different methods of problem resolution from the ones the world is used to. The world conventionally assumes that the processing of problems requires starting from the known, such as the question or conditions, and moving on to the unknown, the so-called answer, in a time sequence following definite steps and logical progression. Nonlinear dynamics moves in the opposite direction, from the unknown, the non-deterministic data of the question, to the known, which is the answer. It operates within a different paradigm of causality. The problem is seen as one of definition and excess, rather than of logical sequence, as in solving a problem by the differential equations. But before we attempt to define the questions of this study further, let us examine some of the material we have introduced in greater detail.
Critical advances in knowledge. Continued. Attractors. At this point, you can review the picture of Lorenz's butterfly.
Attractor is the name given to an identifiable pattern that emerges from a seemingly unmeaningful mass of data. There is a hidden coherence in all that appears incoherent. This inner coherence was first demonstrated in nature by Lorenz in studying computer graphics derived from weather patterns over long courses of time. The attractor pattern he identified is now quite famous as Lorenz's butterfly. Different types of attractors are denoted by different names. For instance, strange attractors. But most important to our research is the discovery that some patterns are very powerful and others are much weaker. There is a critical point which differentiates the two distinct classes. This phenomena is parallel and corollary to the high and low energy bonds in the mathematics of the chemical bond.
Fields of dominance.
A field of dominance is exhibited by high energy patterns in their influence over weaker ones. This may be likened to the coexistence of a small magnetic field within the much larger, more powerful field of a giant electromagnet. The phenomenologic universe is the expression of the interaction of endless attractor patterns of varying strengths. The unending complexities of life are the reflections of the endless reverberations of the augmentations and diminutions of these fields, compounded by their harmonics and other interactions.
Critical point analysis.
The traditional Newtonian concept of causality had excluded all such non-deterministic data because it did not fit into its paradigm. With the discoveries of Einstein, Heisenberg, Bell, Bohr, and others, our model of the universe expanded rapidly. Advanced theoretical physics demonstrated that everything in the universe is subtly dependent and interactive with everything else. The classic Newtonian four-dimensional universe is often described as a giant clockwork, with the three dimensions of space manifesting linear processes and time. As we look at an even simpler clockwork, we will notice that some gears move slowly and ponderously, while others move very rapidly, and tiny balances twirl about as escape mechanisms as they seesaw back and forth. To place pressure on one of the large moving gears would have little effect on the mechanism. However, somewhere there is a delicate balance mechanism, at which point the slightest touch stops the entire device. This is identified as the critical point, where the least force exerts the greatest effect.
Causality.
Within the observable world, causality has conventionally been presumed to work in the manner of A causes B causes C. This is called a deterministic linear sequence, like billiard balls sequentially striking each other. The implicit presumption is that A causes B causes C. But our own research indicates that causality operates in a completely different manner, in which the complex ABC splits through its operants and is expressed instead as the seeming sequence A and then B and then C of perception. From this diagram, we can see that the source, ABC, which is unobservable, results in the visible sequence of A-B-C, which is an observable phenomena within the measurable three-dimensional world. The typical problems the world attempts to deal with exist on the observable level of A-B-C, but our work is to find the inherent attractor pattern, the ABC, out of which the A then B then C seems to arise. So the attractor pattern, ABC, operates then, split through operants into the sequence of observable events called separately A-B-C. In this simple diagram, the operants transcend both the observable and the non-observable. We might picture them as a rainbow bridging the deterministic and the non-deterministic realms. The existence of so-called operants can be inferred by asking the question, what encompasses both the possible and the impossible, the known and the unknown? In other words, what is the matrix of all possibilities? This description of how the universe works is in accord with the theories of physicist David Bohm, who has described a holographic universe with an invisible implicate enfolded and a manifest explicate unfolded order. But it is most important to note that this scientific insight corresponds with the view of reality experienced through history by enlightened sages who have evolved beyond consciousness to the state of pure awareness. Bohm postulates a source that is beyond both the explicate and implicate realms, very much like the state of pure awareness described by the sages. The advent of artificial intelligence supercomputers has allowed the application of the theories of nonlinear dynamics to be applied to the study of brain function through the technique of neurophysiologic modeling. The function of memory especially is being studied by means of neural models, among which attractor networks have been identified. Conclusions of current research are that the brain's neural networks act as a system of attractor patterns, and that stored memories act as attractors, so that the system does not behave in a random fashion overall, although each individual neuron may behave in seemingly random fashion. Neuron models of consciousness disclose a class of neural networks called constraint satisfaction systems. In these systems, a network of interconnected neuron units operates within a series of limits and thus sets up attractor patterns, some of which are now being identified with psychopathology. This kind of modeling correlates behavior with physiology and parallels the results of our kinesiologic muscle testing, demonstrating the connection between mind and body. In terms derived from chaos theory, the clinical study described in the following pages has identified a phase space encompassing the full range of the evolution of human consciousness. Within this range, numerous attractor patterns of increasing power have been denoted. These patterns represent energy fields, which are qualities of consciousness itself, rather than of any particular individual, as is shown by their occurrence across large populations over long periods of time independent of testers or subjects. The evolution of consciousness and the development of human society can be depicted in the mathematical terms of nonlinear dynamics. Our study concerned itself with a limited set of parameters of consciousness, which we calibrated from 1 to 1,000. The numbers represent the logarithm to the base 10 of the power of the respective fields. The entire field or phase space of consciousness itself is unlimited, going on up to infinity. The range of 1 to 600 represents the domain of the vast majority of human experience, and it is the primary scope of this study. The levels from 600 to 1,000, the realm of non-ordinary evolution or enlightenment, is that of sages, and the highest spiritual states will later be described. Within the total field studied, sequential patterns emerged identifying the progressive powers of attractor fields in which there were local variations but global consistency. So-called strange attractors can be of either high or low energy, and the critical point in our data appeared to be at calibration level 200, below which the power of attractors could be described as weak or negative, and above which as strong or positive. By the time we reached the calibration of 600, they were enormously very powerful. An important element of chaos theory helpful in understanding this evolution of consciousness is the law of sensitive dependence on initial conditions. This refers to the fact that a slight variation over a course of time can have the effect of producing a profound change, much as a ship whose bearing is 1 degree off compass eventually finds itself hundreds of miles off course. This phenomenon, which we will refer to in more detail later, is an essential mechanism of all evolution, and also underlies the potential of the creative process. In overview, we can see that from time immemorial, man has tried to make sense of the enormous complexity and frequent unpredictability of human behavior. A multitude of systems has been constructed to try to make that which is incomprehensible comprehensible. To make sense is ordinarily meant to be definable in terms that are linear, logical, and rational, but the process, and therefore the experience of life itself, is organic, that is to say, non-linear by definition. This is the source of man's inescapable intellectual frustration. In this study, however, test responses were independent of our subject's belief systems or intellectual content. What emerged were patterns of energy fields, which were aspects of consciousness itself, irrespective of individual identities. In common left brain, right brain parlance, we could say that the test subjects reacted globally to an attractor field, irrespective of the individual variation of their left brain logic, reason, or sequential thought. The results of the study indicate that profoundly powerful patterns organize human behavior. We can intuit, then, an infinite domain of infinite potential, consciousness itself, within which there is an enormously powerful attractor field organizing all of human behavior into what is innate to humanness. Within the giant attractor field are lesser fields of progressively less energy and power. These fields, in turn, dominate behavior, so that definable patterns are consistent across cultures and time throughout human history. The interactions of these variations within attractor fields make up the history of civilization and mankind. A side study not herein reported indicated that the animal and vegetable kingdoms as well are also controlled by attractor fields of hierarchic power. Our study correlates well with Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic fields hypothesis, as well as Carl Pribham's holographic model of brain-mind function. Note that in a holographic universe, the achievements of every individual contribute to the advance and well-being of the whole. Our study also correlates with the conclusions reached by Nobelist Sir John Eccles, that the brain acts as a receiving set for energy patterns residing within the mind itself, which exists as consciousness expressed in the form of thought. It is the vanity of the ego that claims thoughts as mine. Genius, on the other hand, commonly attributes the source of creative leaps of awareness to that basis of all consciousness which has traditionally been called divinity.
Chapter 2. History and Methodology.
The basis of this work is research done over a 20-year period involving millions of calibrations on thousands of test subjects of all ages and personality types from all walks of life. By design, the study is clinical in method and thus has widespread pragmatic implications. Because this testing method is valid in application to all forms of human expression, calibrations have been successfully taken for literature, architecture, art, science, world events, and the complexity of human relationships. The test space for the determination of the data is the totality of the human experience throughout all of time. Mentally, test subjects range from what the world calls normal to severely ill psychiatric patients. Subjects were tested in Canada, the United States, Mexico, and throughout South America and Northern Europe. They were of all nationalities, ethnic backgrounds, and religions, ranging in age from children to elders in their 90s, and covered a wide spectrum of physical and emotional health. Subjects were tested individually and in groups, by many different testers and groups of testers. In general, the results were identical and reproducible, fulfilling the fundamental requirement of the scientific method, perfect experimental replicability. Subjects were selected at random and tested in a wide array of physical and behavioral settings, on top of mountains and at the seashore, at holiday parties and during the course of everyday work, in moments of joy and moments of sorrow. None of these circumstances affected the test results, which were found to be universally consistent, irrespective of extraneous factors, with the exception of the methodology of the testing procedure itself. And because of the significance of this factor, the testing method will be described in some detail below.
Historical background.
In 1971, 3 physiotherapists published a definitive study on muscle testing, and Dr. George Goodhart of Detroit, Michigan, studied muscle testing techniques extensively in his clinical practice and made the breakthrough discovery that the strength or weakness of every muscle was connected to the health or pathology of a specific corresponding body organ. He further determined that each individual muscle was associated with an acupuncture meridian, and correlated his work with that of the physician Felix Mann on the medical significance of the acupuncture meridians. By 1976, Goodhart's book on applied kinesiology had reached its 12th edition. He began to teach the technique to his colleagues and also published monthly research tapes. His work was rapidly picked up by others, which led to the formation of the International College of Kinesiology, many members of which also belong to the Academy of Preventive Medicine. A thorough exposition of the development of the field was detailed by David Walther in his extensive volume on applied kinesiology, also published in 1976. The most striking finding of kinesiology initially was a clear demonstration that muscles instantly became weak when the body is exposed to harmful stimuli. For instance, if a patient with hypoglycemia put sugar on his tongue, on muscle testing, the deltoid muscle, which is the one usually used as an indicator muscle, instantly went weak. Accordingly, it was discovered that substances which were therapeutic to the body made the muscles instantly become strong. Because the weakness of any particular muscle indicated the presence of a pathologic process in its corresponding organ, corroborated by diagnosis through acupuncture and physical or laboratory examination, it was a highly useful clinical tool to detect disease. Thousands of practitioners began to use the method, and data rapidly accumulated showing kinesiology to be an important and reliable diagnostic technique which could accurately monitor a patient's response to treatment as well as diagnosis. The technique found widespread acceptance among professionals from many disciplines, and although it never caught on in mainstream medicine, it was used extensively by holistically oriented physicians. One of these was Dr. John Diamond, a psychiatrist, who began to use kinesiology in diagnosing and treating psychiatric patients. He labeled this extended use of kinesiology as behavioral kinesiology. While other investigators were researching the usefulness of the method in detecting allergies, nutritional and other disorders, and response to medication, Dr. Diamond used the technique to research the beneficial or adverse effects of a great variety of sensory and psychological stimuli, such as art forms, music, facial expression, voice modulation, and emotional stress. He was an excellent teacher, and his seminars attracted thousands of professionals who returned to their own practices with renewed interest and curiosity as they explored applications of the technique. In addition to its inclusive applicability, the test was quick, simple, easy to perform, and highly decisive. All researchers confirmed the replicability of test results. For example, an artificial sweetener made every subject test weak, whether placed on the tongue, held in its package adjacent to the solar plexus, or hidden in a plain envelope, the contents of which neither the tester nor the subject knew. That the body responded even when the mind was naive was most impressive. Most practitioners did their own verification research, placing various substances in plain numbered envelopes and having a naive second person test a third. The overwhelming conclusion was that the body would indeed respond accurately even when the conscious mind was unaware. The reliability of the testing experience never ceased to amaze the public and patients, and for that matter, the practitioners themselves. When this author was on the lecture circuit, for instance, in audiences of 1,000 people, 500 envelopes containing artificial sweetener would be passed out to the audience, along with 500 identical envelopes containing organic vitamin C. The audience would be divided up and would alternate testing each other. When the envelopes were opened, the audience reaction was always one of amazement and delight when they saw that all had gone weak in response to the artificial sweetener and strong in response to the organic vitamin C. The nutritional habits of thousands of families across the country were changed by this simple demonstration. In the early 1970s, the medical profession in general, and psychiatry in particular, was highly resistant, if not forthrightly hostile, to the idea that nutrition had much to do with health at all, let alone emotional health or brain function. Publication of the book Orthomolecular Psychiatry by this author and Nobelist Linus Pauling received a favorable reception from a wide variety of audiences, but not from the basic medical establishment itself. Interestingly enough, 20 years later, the concepts presented in the book are now fundamental to current treatment of mental illness. The thrust of the book was that mental illness, such as psychosis, as well as lesser ones, such as emotional disorders, had a genetic basis involving an abnormal biochemical pathway in the brain, a molecular basis which could be corrected on the molecular level. Manic depressive illness, schizophrenia, alcoholism, depression, and others therefore could be affected by nutrition as well as medication. In 1973, when the book was published, the psychiatric establishment was still psychoanalytically oriented, and the work was accepted primarily by holistic practitioners. The suggested treatment methods and results were frequently verified with kinesiology. However, it was Dr. Diamond's demonstration that the body instantly went weak in response to unhealthy emotional attitudes or mental stresses, which had the greatest ongoing clinical influence. His refinement of the muscle testing technique, the one used by most practitioners, was used in this study over a period of 20 years. It was universally observed by practitioners and researchers as well as this author that test responses were completely independent of the test subject's belief systems, intellectual opinions, reason, or logic. It was also observed that a test response where the subject went weak was accompanied by desynchronization of the cerebral hemispheres.
The testing technique.
2 persons are required. One acts as test subject by holding out one arm laterally parallel to the ground. The second person then presses down with 2 fingers on the wrist of the extended arm and says, "Resist." The subject then resists the downward pressure with all their strength. That is all there is to it. A statement may be made by either party. While the subject holds it in mind, his arm's strength is tested by the tester's downward pressure. If the statement is negative or false or reflects a calibration below 200, the test subject will go weak. If the answer is yes or calibrates over 200, they will go strong. To demonstrate the procedure, one might have the subject hold an image of Abraham Lincoln in mind while being tested, and then for contrast, an image of Adolf Hitler. The same effect can be demonstrated by holding in mind someone who is loved, in contrast to someone who is feared or hated, or about whom there is some strong regret. Once a numeric scale is elicited, calibrations can be arrived at by stating, this item, for instance a book or an organization or some person, calibrates over 100. Then they calibrate over 150. Then they calibrate over 200. Then they calibrate over 300, and so on until a negative response is obtained. The calibration can then be refined. For instance, it is over 220, over 225, over 230, etc. Tester and testee can trade places, and the same results will be obtained. Once one is familiar with the technique, it can be used to evaluate companies, movies, individuals, events in history, or for the diagnosis of current life problems.
History and methodology continued.
The test procedure, the reader will note, is to use the muscle test to verify the truth or falsity of a declarative statement. Unreliable responses will be obtained if the question has not been put into this form. Nor can a reliable result be obtained from inquiry into the future. Only statements regarding existent conditions or events in the past or present will produce consistent answers. It is necessary to be impersonal during the procedure to avoid transmitting positive or negative feelings. Accuracy is increased by having the test subject close their eyes, and there should be no music or distractions in the background. Because the test is so deceptively simple, it is well that an inquirer first verify its accuracy to their own satisfaction. Responses can be checked by cross-questioning, and everyone who becomes acquainted with the technique thinks of tricks to satisfy themselves that it is reliable. It will be soon found that the same response is observed in all subjects, that it is not necessary for them to have any knowledge of the matter in question, and that the response will always be independent of the test subject's personal opinions about the question. Before presenting an inquiry, we have found that it is useful to first test the statement, "I have permission to ask this question." This is analogous to an entry requisite on a computer terminal and will occasionally return a no answer. This indicates that one should leave the question alone or inquire carefully further into the reason for the no. Perhaps the questioner might have experienced psychological distress from the answer or its implications at that time, or for other unknown reasons. In this study, test subjects were asked to focus on a specified thought, feeling, attitude, memory, relationship, or life circumstance. The test was frequently done on large groups of people for demonstration purposes. We first established the baseline by asking the subjects, with eyes closed, to hold in mind the memory of a time when they were angry, upset, jealous, depressed, guilty, or fearful. At that point, everyone universally went weak. We would then ask them to hold in mind a loving person or life situation, and everyone would go strong. Typically, a murmur of surprise rippled through the audience at the implications of what they had just discovered. The next phenomenon demonstrated was that the mere image of a substance held in mind produced the same response as if the substance itself were in physical contact with the body. As an example, we could hold up an apple grown with pesticides and ask the audience to look directly at it while being tested. All would go weak. We would then hold up an organically grown apple, free of contaminants, and as the audience focused on it, they would instantly go strong. Inasmuch as no one in the audience knew which apple was which, nor for that matter, had any anticipation of the test at all, the reliability of the method was demonstrated to everyone's satisfaction. For reliability of results, it should be remembered that people process experience differently. Some people primarily adopt a feeling mode, others are more auditory, and still others are more visual. Therefore, test questions should avoid such phrasing as, "How do you feel about a person, situation, or experience?" or "How does it look?" or "How does it sound?" Customarily, if one says, "Hold the situation in mind," the subject will instinctively select their own appropriate mode. Occasionally, in an effort, perhaps even unconscious, to disguise their response, subjects will select a mode which is not their customary mode of processing and give a false response. When the tester elicits a paradoxical response, the question should be rephrased. For example, a patient who feels guilty about his anger towards his mother may hold in mind a photograph of her and test strong. However, if the tester were to rephrase the question and ask the subject to hold in mind his present attitude toward his mother, he would then go weak. Other precautions to maintain the accuracy of the test include removing eyeglasses, especially if they have metal frames, and hats. Synthetic materials on top of the head make everyone go weak. The testing arm should also be free of jewelry, especially quartz wristwatches. When an anomalous response does occur, further investigation will eventually reveal the cause. The tester, for instance, might be wearing a perfume to which the patient has an adverse reaction and produce false negative responses. If a tester experiences repeated failures in attempting to elicit an accurate response, the effect of their voice on other test subjects should be evaluated. Some testers, at least at certain times, may express sufficient negative energy in their voices to affect test results. Another factor to be considered in the face of a paradoxical response is the time frame of the memory or image involved. If a test subject is holding in mind a given person and their relationship, the response will depend on the period the memory or image represents. If he is remembering his relationship with his brother from childhood, he may have a different response than if he is holding in mind an image of his relationship with his brother as it is today. Questioning always has to be narrowed down specifically. One other cause for paradoxical test results is a physical condition of the test subject resulting from stress or depression of thymic gland function, which occurs from encountering a very negative energy field. The thymus gland is the central controller of the body's acupuncture energy system, and when its energy is low, test results are unpredictable. This can easily be remedied in a few seconds by a simple technique discovered by Dr. John Diamond, which he called the thymic thump. The thymus gland is located directly behind the top of the breastbone. With clenched fist, pound over the area rhythmically several times while smiling and thinking of someone you love. At each thump say, ha ha ha. Retesting will now show the resumption of thymic dominance, and normal test results will occur.
Use of the testing procedure in this study.
The testing technique just described is that recommended by Dr. Diamond in the book Behavioral Kinesiology. The only variation introduced in our study was the correlation of responses with a logarithmic scale to calibrate the relative power of the energy of different attitudes, thoughts, feelings, situations, and relationships. Because the test is rapid and actually takes less than a few seconds, it is possible to process an enormous amount of information about a variety of matters in a very short time. The numerical scale, elicited spontaneously from test subjects, ranges from the value of mere physical existence at 1 up to 600 in the ordinary worldly realm, which is the apex of ordinary consciousness. Then from 600 on to 1,000 includes advanced states of enlightenment. Responses in the form of a simple yes or no answer determine the calibration of a subject. For example, if just being alive is 1, then the power of love is over 200, ? Subject goes strong, indicating yes. Love is over 300, subject still goes strong. Love is over 400, subject still goes strong. Love is 500 or over, subject still strong. In this case, love calibrated at 500, and this figure proved reproducible regardless of how many test subjects were tested. With repeated testing of either individuals or groups, a consistent scale emerged, which correlated well with human experience, with history, and common opinion, as well as the findings of psychology, sociology, psychoanalysis, philosophy, and medicine, and the famous great chain of being. It also correlates quite precisely with the perennial philosophy's strata of consciousness. The tester must be cautious, however, realizing that the answers to some questions could be disturbing to the subject. The technique must not be used irresponsibly, and the tester must always respect the subject's willingness to participate. It should never be used as a confrontational technique. In clinical situations, a personal question is never posed to the test subject unless it is pertinent for a therapeutic purpose. It is possible, though, to pose a question which precludes personal involvement on the part of the test subject, who then functions merely as an indicator for the purposes of calibration or research. The test response is independent of the subject's actual physical strength. It is frequently dumbfounding to well-muscled athletes when they go just as weak as everyone else in response to a noxious stimulus. The tester may well be a frail woman who weighs less than 100 pounds, and the subject may be a professional football player who weighs more than 200, but the test results will be the same as she puts down his powerful arm with a mere 2 fingers.
Chapter 3. Test Results and Interpretation.
A goal of this study is to generate a practical map of the energy fields of consciousness so as to delineate the range and general geography of an uncharted area of human investigation. In order to make this more easily comprehensible for the reader, the numerical designations arrived at for the various energy fields have been rounded off to comparative figures. If we look at the map of consciousness, it becomes clear that the calibrated levels correlate with specific processes of consciousness, emotions, perceptions, attitudes, worldviews, and spiritual beliefs. If space permitted, the chart could be extended to include all areas of human behavior. Throughout, the research results were mutually corroborating. The more detailed and extensive the investigation, the greater was the corroboration.
At this point, you can review the enclosed map of consciousness.
The critical response point in the scale of consciousness calibrates at level 200, which is the level associated with courage. All attitudes, thoughts, feelings, and associations below that level of calibration make a person go weak. Attitudes, thoughts, feelings, entities, or historic figures which calibrate higher make subjects go strong. This is the balance point between weak and strong attractors, between negative and positive influence, and between truth and falsehood. At the levels below 200, the primary impetus is survival, although at the very bottom of the scale, in the zone of hopelessness and depression, even that motive is lacking. The levels of fear and anger are characterized by egocentric impulses which arise from these drives for personal survival. At the level of pride, the survival motive may expand to include others as well. As one crosses the demarcation between negative and positive influence and goes on into courage, the well-being of others becomes increasingly important. By the 500 level, the happiness of others emerges as the essential motivating force. The high 500s are characterized by interest in spiritual awareness for both oneself and others. And by the 600s, the good of mankind and the search for enlightenment are the primary goals. From 700 to 1000, life is dedicated to the salvation of all of humanity.
Discussion.
Reflection on this map can induce a profound expansion of one's empathy for life in its variety of expressions. If we examine what are generally held to be less virtuous emotional attitudes, we realize that essentially they are neither good nor bad. Moralistic judgments are merely a function of the viewpoint from which they emanate. We see, for instance, that a person in grief, which calibrates at the energy level of 75, will be much better if they rise to anger, which calibrates at 150. Anger, however, itself is a destructive motion, and is still a low state of consciousness. But as social history shows, apathy can imprison entire subcultures as well as individuals. If the hopeless can come to wanting something better, desire at 125, and then use the energy of anger at 150 to develop pride at 175, they may then be able to take the step to courage, which calibrates at 200, and proceed to actually ameliorate their individual or collective conditions. Conversely, the person who has arrived at a habitual state of unconditional love will experience anything less as unacceptable. As one advances in the evolution of their individual consciousness, the process becomes self-perpetuating and self-correcting, so that self-improvement becomes a way of life. This phenomenon can be commonly observed among members of 12-step groups who constantly work at overcoming negative attitudes such as self-pity or intolerance. People further down on the scale of consciousness may find these same attitudes acceptable and even righteously defend them. Throughout history, all the world's great religions and spiritual disciplines have been concerned with techniques to ascend through these levels of consciousness. Most have also implied or specifically stated that to move up this ladder is an arduous task, and that success depends on having a teacher, or at least teachings, to give specific instructions and inspiration to the aspirant, who might otherwise despair over their inability to achieve the goal unaided. Hopefully our chart may facilitate this ultimate human endeavor. The epistemologic effect of awareness of this schema is subtle, but can be far-reaching. Implications of these findings have pragmatic applications to sports, medicine, psychiatry, psychology, to personal relationships, and the general quest for happiness. Contemplation of the map of consciousness itself can, for instance, transform one's understanding of causality. As perception itself evolves with one's level of consciousness, it becomes apparent that what the world calls the domain of causes is, in fact, the domain of effects. By taking responsibility for the consequences of their own perceptions, the observer can transcend the role of victim to an understanding that nothing out there has power over you. It is not life's events, but how one reacts to them, the attitude that one has about them, which determines whether they have a positive or negative effect on one's life, and whether they are experienced as opportunity or as stress. Psychological stress is the effect of a condition you are resisting or wish to escape, but the condition does not have any power in and of itself. Nothing has the power within itself to create stress. The loud music that raises the blood pressure of one person can be a source of delight to another. A divorce may be traumatic if it is unwanted, or a release into freedom if it is desired. The map of consciousness also casts a new light on the progress of history. A most important distinction for the purpose of this study is that between force and power. We can, for example, investigate an historical epoch such as the end of British colonialism in India. If we calibrate the position of the British Empire at the time, which is one of self-interest and exploitation, we find that it was well below the critical level of 200 on the scale of consciousness. The motivation of Mahatma Gandhi, in contrast, calibrated at 700 and was very near the top of the range of normal human consciousness. Gandhi won in this struggle because his position was one of far greater power. The British Empire, at calibration 175, represented force, and when force meets power, force is eventually defeated. We may observe how throughout history, society has tried to treat social problems by legislative action, warfare, market manipulation, laws, and prohibitions, all of which are manifestations of force, only to see these problems persist or recur despite this treatment. Although governments or individuals who proceed from positions of force are myopic, to the sensitive observer it will eventually become obvious that conditions of social conflict will not disappear until the underlying etiology has been exposed and healed. The difference between treating and healing is that in the former, the context remains the same, whereas in the latter, the clinical response is elicited by a change of context, so as to bring about an absolute removal of the basis of the condition rather than mere recovery from its symptoms. It is one thing to prescribe an antihypertensive medication for high blood pressure, and quite another to expand the patient's context of life to the degree that they stop being angry and hostile and repressive. The empathy derived from contemplating this map of consciousness will hopefully make it a shorter step to joy. The key to joy is the unconditional kindness to all of life, including one's own, which we've referred to as compassion. Without compassion, little of any significance is ever accomplished in human endeavor. We may generalize to the greater social context from individual therapies, wherein the patient cannot be truly cured or fundamentally healed until they invoke the power of compassion both for themselves and others. At that point, the healed may themselves become a healer.
Chapter 4. Levels of Human Consciousness.
Millions of calibrations over the years of this study have defined a range of values accurately corresponding to well-recognized sets of attitudes and emotions. These are localized by specific attractor energy fields, much as electromagnetic fields gather iron filings. We have adopted the following classification of these energy fields so as to be easily comprehensible as well as clinically and subjectively accurate. It is very important to remember that the calibration figures do not represent an arithmetic, but instead a logarithmic progression. Thus, level 300 is not twice the amplitude of 150. It is 300 to the 10th power. In other words, 300 times 300 times 300 times 300, 10 times. Therefore, an increase of even a few points represents a major advance in power. The rate of increase in power as we move up the scale is therefore enormous. The ways the various levels of human consciousness express themselves are profound and far-reaching, and their effects are both gross and subtle. All levels below 200 are destructive of life in both the individual and society at large. In contrast, levels above 200 are constructive expressions of power. The decisive level of 200 is the fulcrum that divides the general areas of force or falsehood from truth and power. In describing the emotional correlates of the energy fields of consciousness, it is well to remember that they rarely are manifested as pure states in an individual. A person may operate on one level in a given area of life and on quite another level in another area of life. An individual's overall level of consciousness is the sum total effect of all these various levels.
Energy level 20, Shame.
The level of shame is perilously proximate to death, which may be chosen out of shame as conscious suicide, or more subtly elected by failure to take steps to prolong life, one might say passive suicide. Death by avoidable accident is common. We all have some awareness of the pain of losing face, becoming discredited, and a non-person. In shame, people hang their heads, slink away, and wish they were invisible. Banishment is a traditional accompaniment of shame, and in primitive societies from which we all originate, banishment is equivalent to death. Early life experiences, such as sexual abuse, which lead to shame, warp the personality, often for a lifetime, unless these issues are resolved by therapy. Shame, as Freud determined, produces neurosis. It is destructive to emotional and psychological health, and, as a consequence of low self-esteem, makes one prone to the development of physical illness. The shame-based personality is shy, withdrawn, and introverted. Shame is also used as a tool of cruelty, and its victims often become themselves cruel. Shamed children are cruel to animals and cruel to each other. The behavior of people whose consciousness level is only in the 20s is dangerous. They are prone to hallucinations of an accusatory nature, as well as paranoia. Some become psychotic or commit bizarre crimes. Some shame-based individuals compensate by perfectionism and rigidity, and often become driven and intolerant. Notorious examples of this are the moral extremists, who form vigilante groups, projecting their own unconscious shame onto others, whom they then feel justified in righteously attacking or killing. Serial killers have often acted out of sexual moralism, with the justification of punishing so-called bad women. Because it pulls down the whole level of one's personality, shame results in a vulnerability to the other negative emotions, and therefore often produces false pride, anger, and guilt.
Energy level 30, guilt.
Guilt, so commonly used in our society to manipulate and punish, manifests itself in a variety of expressions, such as remorse, self-recrimination, masochism, and the whole gamut of symptoms of victimhood. Unconscious guilt results in psychosomatic disease, accident proneness, and suicidal behaviors. Many people struggle with guilt their entire lives, while others desperately attempt to escape by amorally denying guilt altogether. Guilt domination results in a preoccupation with sin, an unforgiving emotional attitude, frequently exploited by religious demagogues who used it for coercion and control. Such sin and salvation merchants, obsessed with punishment, are likely either acting out their own guilt or projecting it onto others. Subcultures displaying the aberration of self-flagellation often manifest other endemic forms of cruelty, such as the public ritual killing of humans or animals. Guilt provokes rage, and killing frequently is its expression. Capital punishment is an example of how killing gratifies a guilt-ridden populace. Our unforgiving American society, for instance, pillories its victims in the press and metes out punishments which have never been demonstrated to have any deterrent or corrective effect.
Energy level 50, apathy.
This level is characterized by poverty, despair, and hopelessness. The world and the future look bleak. Pathos is the theme of life. It is a state of helplessness. Its victims, needy in every way, lack not only resources, but the energy to avail themselves of what resources may be available. Unless external energy is supplied by caregivers, death through passive suicide can result. Without the will to live, the hopeless stare blankly, unresponsive to stimuli, until their eyes finally stop tracking, and there is not even enough energy left to swallow proffered food. This is the level of the homeless and the derelicts of society. It is also the fate of many of the aged and others who become isolated by chronic or progressive diseases. The apathetic are dependent, people in apathy are heavy, and are felt to be a burden by those around them. Too often society lacks sufficient motivation to be of any real help to cultures as well as individuals at this level who are seen as drains of resources. This is the level of the streets of Calcutta, where only the saintly, such as Mother Teresa and her followers, dare to tread. It is the level of the abandonment of hope, and few have the courage to really look it in the face.
Energy level 75. Grief.
This is the level of sadness, loss, and despondency. Most humans have experienced it for periods of time, but those who remain at this level live a life of constant regret and depression. This is the level of chronic mourning, bereavement, and remorse about the past. It is also the level of habitual losers and chronic gamblers who accept failure as part of their lifestyle, often resulting in loss of jobs, friends, family, and opportunity, as well as money and health. Major losses in early life make one later vulnerable to passive acceptance of grief as though sorrow were the price of life. In grief, one sees sadness everywhere. The sadness of little children, the sadness of world conditions, the sadness of life itself. This level colors one's entire vision of existence. Part of the syndrome of loss is the notion of the irreplaceability of what is lost or that which it symbolized. There is a generalization from the particular, so that the loss of a loved one is equated with the loss of love itself. At this level, such emotional losses may trigger a serious depression or death. Though grief is the cemetery of life, it still has more energy to it than does apathy. Thus, when a traumatized, apathetic patient begins to cry, we know they are getting better. Once they start to cry, they will begin to eat again.
Energy level 100. Fear.
At the level of 100, there is a lot more life energy available. Fear of danger is actually healthy. Fear runs much of the world, spurring endless activity. There is fear of enemies, fear of old age, fear of death, fear of rejection, and the multitude of social fears are basic motivators in most people's lives. From the viewpoint of this level, the world looks hazardous, full of traps and threats. Fear is the favorite official tool for control by oppressive totalitarian agencies and regiments, and insecurity is the stock in trade of major manipulators of the marketplace. The media and advertising play to fear to increase market share. The proliferation of fears is as limitless as the human imagination. Once fear becomes one's focus, the endless fearful events of the world feed it. Fear then can become obsessive and may take any form. Fear of loss of relationship leads to jealousy and a chronically high stress level. Fearful thinking can balloon into paranoia or generate neurotic defensive structures, and because it is contagious, become a dominant social trend. Fear limits growth of the personality and leads to inhibition. Because it takes energy to rise above fear, the oppressed are unable to reach a higher level unaided. Thus the fearful seek strong leaders who appear to have conquered their fear to lead them out of their slavery.
Energy level 125. Desire.
There is yet more energy available at this level. Desire motivates vast areas of human activity, including the economy. Advertisers play on desires to program us with needs linked to instinctual drives. Desire moves us to expend great effort to achieve goals or obtain rewards. The desire for money, prestige, or power runs the lives of many of those who have risen above fear as their limiting predominant life motif. Desire is also the level of addictions, wherein desire becomes a craving more important than life itself. The victim of desire may actually be unaware of the basis of their motives. Some people become addicted to the desire for attention and drive others away by their constant demands. The desire for sexual approval has produced an entire cosmetic and fashion and movie industries. Desire has to do with accumulation and greed. But desire is insatiable because it is an ongoing energy field, so that satisfaction of one desire is merely replaced by unsatisfied desire for something else. Multimillionaires remain obsessed with acquiring more and more money. Desire, however, is a much higher state than apathy or grief, obviously. In order to get, you have to first have the energy to want. TV has had a major influence on many oppressed people. because it inculcates wants and energizes their desires to the degree that they move out of apathy and begin to seek a better life. Want can start people on the road to achievement. Desire can, therefore, become a springboard to higher levels of consciousness.
Energy level 150. Anger.
Although anger may lead to homicide and war, as an energy level within itself, it is farther removed from death than those below it. Anger can lead to either constructive or destructive action. As people move out of apathy and grief to overcome fear, they begin to want. Desire leads to frustration, which in turn leads to anger. Thus, anger can be a fulcrum by which the oppressed are eventually catapulted to freedom. Anger over social injustices, victimization, and inequality have created great movements that led to major changes in the structure of society. But anger expresses itself most often as resentment and revenge, and is therefore volatile and dangerous. Anger as a lifestyle is exemplified by irritable, explosive people who are oversensitive to slights and become injustice collectors, quarrelsome, belligerent, or litigious. As anger stems from frustrated want, it is based on the energy field below it. Frustration results from exaggerating the importance of desires. The angry person may, like a frustrated infant, go into a rage. Anger leads easily to hatred, which has an erosive effect on all areas of a person's life.
Energy level 175. Pride.
Pride, which calibrates at 175, has enough energy to run the United States Marine Corps. It is the level aspired to by the majority of our kind today. People feel positive as they reach this level, in contrast to the lower energy fields. This rise in self-esteem is a balm to all the pain experienced at the lower levels of consciousness. Pride looks good and knows it. It struts its stuff in the parade of life. Pride is at a far enough removal from shame, guilt, or fear that to rise, for instance, out of the despair of the ghetto to the pride of being Marine is an enormous jump. Pride as such generally has a good reputation and is socially encouraged. Yet, as we see from the chart of the levels of consciousness, it is still sufficiently negative to remain below the critical level of 200. This is why pride feels good only in contrast to the lower levels. The problem, as we all know, is that pride goeth before a fall. Pride is defensive and vulnerable because it is dependent upon external conditions, without which it can suddenly revert to a lower level. The inflated ego is vulnerable to attack. Pride remains weak because it can be knocked off of its pedestal into shame, which is the threat that fires the fear of loss of pride. Pride is divisive and gives rise to factionalism. The consequences are costly. Man has habitually died for pride. Armies still regularly slaughter each other for that aspect of pride called nationalism. Religious wars, political terrorism, and zealotry, the ghastly history of the Middle East and Central Europe, are all the price of pride which all of society pays. The downside, therefore, of pride is arrogance and denial. These characteristics block growth. In pride, recovery from addictions is impossible because emotional problems or character defects are denied. The whole problem of denial is one of pride. Thus, pride is a very sizable block to the acquisition of real power, which displaces pride with true stature and prestige.
Energy level 200. Courage.
At the 200 level, power really first appears. When we test subjects at all the energy levels below 200, we find, as can be readily verified, that they all go weak. Everyone goes strong in response to the life-supportive fields above 200. This is the critical level that distinguishes the positive and negative influences of life. At the level of courage, an attainment of true power occurs. Therefore, it is also the level of empowerment. This is the zone of exploration, accomplishment, fortitude, and determination. At the lower levels, the world is seen as hopeless, sad, frightening, or frustrating. But at the level of courage, life is seen to be exciting, challenging, and stimulating. Courage implies the willingness to try new things and deal with the vicissitudes of life. At this level of empowerment, one is able to cope with and handle effectively the opportunities of life. At 200, for instance, there is the energy to learn new job skills. Growth and education become attainable goals. There is the capacity to face fears or character defects and to grow despite them. And anxiety does not cripple endeavor as it would at the lower levels of evolution. Obstacles which defeat people whose consciousness is below 200 act as stimulants to those who have evolved into the first level of true power. People at this level put back into the world as much energy as they take. At lower levels, populations as well as individuals drain energy from society without reciprocating. Because accomplishment results in positive feedback, self-reward and esteem become progressively self-reinforcing. This is where true productivity begins. The collective level of consciousness of mankind remained at 190 for many centuries, and curiously only jumped to its current level of 204 within the last decade.
Levels of human consciousness continued. Energy level 250, neutrality.
Energy becomes very positive as we get to the level which we have termed neutral, because it is epitomized by release from the positionality which typifies lower levels. Below 250, consciousness tends to see dichotomies and take on rigid positions, which is an impediment in a world which is complex and multifactorial rather than just black and white. Taking such positions creates polarization, and polarization in turn creates opposition and division. As in the martial arts, a rigid position becomes a point of vulnerability. That which does not bend is liable to break. Rising above barriers or oppositions which dissipate one's energies, the neutral condition allows for flexibility and a non-judgmental, realistic appraisal of problems. To be neutral means to be relatively unattached to outcomes. Not getting one's way is no longer experienced as defeating, frightening, or frustrating. At the neutral level, a person can say, well, if I don't get this job, then I'll get another. This is the beginning of inner confidence. Sensing one's power, one is therefore not easily intimidated. One is not driven to prove anything. The expectation that life, with its ups and downs, will be basically okay if one can roll with it, that is a typical calibration level 250 attitude. People at neutrality have a sense of well-being. The mark of this level is confident capability to live in the world. This is therefore experientially a level of safety. People at the neutral level are easy to get along with, safe to be around and associate with, because they are not interested in conflict, competition, or guilt. They are comfortable and basically undisturbed emotionally. This attitude is non-judgmental and does not lead to any need to control other people's behaviors. Correspondingly, because neutral people value freedom, they are hard to control.
Energy level 310, willingness.
This very positive level of energy may be seen as the gateway to the higher levels. Whereas jobs, for instance, are done adequately at the neutral level, at the level of willingness, work is done well and success in all endeavors is common. Growth is rapid. These are people chosen for advancement. Willingness implies that one has overcome inner resistance to life and is committed to participation. Below the 200 calibration level, people tend to be closed-minded, but by level 310, a great opening occurs. At this level, people become genuinely friendly, and social and economic success seem to come automatically. The willing are not really troubled by unemployment, for they will take any job when they have to, or they will create a career or go into self-employment for themselves. They do not feel demeaned by service jobs or by having to start at the bottom. They are naturally helpful to others and contribute to the good of society. They are also willing to face inner issues and do not have major learning blocks. At this level, self-esteem is innately high and is reinforced by positive feedback from society in the forms of recognition, appreciation, and reward. Willingness is sympathetic and responsive to the needs of others. Willing people are builders of and contributors to society. With their capacity to bounce back from adversity and learn from experience, they tend to become self-correcting. Having let go of pride, they are willing to look at their own defects and learn from others. At the level of willingness, people become excellent students. They are easily teachable and represent a considerable source of power for society.
Energy level 350, acceptance.
At this level of awareness, a major transformation takes place with the understanding that one is oneself, the source and creator of the experience of one's life. Taking such responsibility is distinctive of this degree of evolution, which is characterized by the capacity to live harmoniously with the forces of life. All people at levels below 200 tend to be powerless and see themselves as victims at the mercy of life. This stems from a belief that the source of one's happiness or the causes of one's problem is so-called out there. An enormous jump, taking back one's own power, is completed at this level with the realization that the source of happiness is within oneself. At this more evolved stage, nothing so-called out there has the capacity to really make one happy. And love is not something that is given or taken away by another, but is created from within. Acceptance is not to be confused with passivity, which is a symptom of apathy. This form of acceptance allows engagement in life on life's own terms, without trying to make it conform to an agenda. With acceptance, there is emotional calm and perception is widened as denial is transcended. One now sees things without distortion or misinterpretation. The context of experience is expanded so that one is capable of seeing the whole picture. Acceptance has to do essentially with balance, proportion, and appropriateness. The individual at the level of acceptance is not interested in determining right or wrong, but instead is dedicated to resolving issues and finding out what to do about problems. Tough jobs do not cause discomfort or dismay. Long-term goals take precedence over short-term ones. Self-discipline and mastery are prominent. At the level of acceptance, we are not polarized by conflict or opposition. We see that other people have the same rights as we do, and we honor equality. While lower levels are characterized by rigidity, at this level, social plurality begins to emerge as a form of resolution of problems. Therefore, this level is free of discrimination and intolerance. There is an awareness that equality does not preclude diversity. Acceptance includes rather than rejects.
Energy level 400, reason.
Intelligence and rationality rise to the forefront when the emotionalism of the lower levels is transcended. Reason is capable of handling large, complex amounts of data and making rapid, correct decisions. It's capable of understanding the intricacies of relationships, gradations, and fine distinctions, and also of expert manipulation of symbols as abstract concepts, which become increasingly important. This is the level of science, medicine, and of generally increased capability for conceptualization and comprehension. Knowledge and education are sought as capital. Understanding and information are the main tools of accomplishment, which is the hallmark of the 400 level. This is the level of Nobel Prize winners, great statesmen, Supreme Court justices, Einstein, Freud, and many other important figures in the history of thought calibrate here. And the authors of the great books of the Western world calibrate here. The shortcomings of this level are failure to clearly distinguish the difference between symbols and what they represent, and confusion between the objective and subjective worlds that limits the understanding of causality. At this level, it's easy to lose sight of the forest for the trees. You become infatuated with concepts and theories, and ending up in intellectualism and missing the essential point. Intellectualizing can become an end in itself. Reason is limited in that it does not afford the capacity for the discernment of essence or the critical point of a complex issue, and generally disregards context. Reason does not of itself provide a guide to truth. It produces massive amounts of information and documentation, but lacks the capability to resolve discrepancies in data and conclusions. All philosophic arguments sound convincing on their own. Although reason is highly effective in a technical world where the methodologies of logic dominate, reason itself paradoxically is the major block to reaching higher levels of consciousness, and transcending this level is relatively uncommon in our society, by only 4%.
Energy level 500. Love.
Love, as it is depicted in the mass media, is not what this level implies. On the contrary, what the world generally refers to as love is an intense emotionality combining physical attraction, possessiveness, control, even addiction, eroticism, novelty. It is usually evanescent and fluctuating, waxing and waning with varying conditions. When frustrated, this emotion often reveals an underlying anger and dependency that it had masked. That love can turn to hate is a common concept. But what is being spoken about then, rather than love, is an addictive sentimentality and an attachment. Hate stems from pride, not love. There probably never was actual love, therefore, in such a relationship. The 500 level is characterized by the development of a love which is unconditional, unchanging, and permanent. It does not fluctuate because its source within the person who loves is not dependent on external conditions. Loving is a state of being. It is a way of relating to the world, which is forgiving, nurturing, and supportive. Love is not intellectual and does not proceed from the mind. Love emanates from the heart. It has the capacity to lift others and accomplish great feats because of the purity of its motive. At this level of development, the capacity to discern essence becomes more predominant. The core of an issue becomes the center of focus. As reason is bypassed, there arises the capacity for instantaneous recognition of the totality of a problem and a major expansion of context, especially regarding time and process. Reason deals only with particulars, whereas love deals with wholes. This ability, often ascribed to intuition, is the capacity for instantaneously understanding without resort to sequential symbol processing. This apparently abstract phenomenon is, in fact, quite concrete. It is accompanied by a measurable release of endorphins in the brain. Love takes no position and thus is global, rising above the separation of positionality. It is then possible to be one with another, as there are no longer any barriers. Love is therefore inclusive and expands the sense of self progressively. Love focuses on the goodness of life in all its expressions and augments that which is positive. It dissolves negativity by recontextualizing it rather than by attacking it. This is the level of true happiness, but although the world is fascinated with the subject of love, and all viable religions calibrate at 500 or over, it is interesting to note that only 0.4% of the world's population ever reaches this level of the evolution of consciousness.
Energy level 540. Joy.
As love becomes more and more unconditional, it begins to be experienced as an inner joy. This is not the sudden joy of a pleasurable turn of events. It is a constant accompaniment to all activities. Joy arises from within each moment of existence, rather than from any external source. 540 is also the level of healing and of spiritually based self-help groups. From level 540 up is the domain of saints, spiritual healers, and advanced spiritual students. Characteristic of this energy field is the capacity for enormous patience and the persistence of a positive attitude in the face of prolonged adversity. The hallmark of this state is compassion. People who have attained this level have a notable effect on others. They are capable of prolonged open visual gaze, which induces a state of love and peace. At the high 500s, the world one sees is illuminated by the exquisite beauty and perfection of creation. Everything happens effortlessly by synchronicity, and the world and everything in it is seen to be an expression of love and divinity. Individual will merges into divine will. A presence is felt whose power facilitates phenomena outside conventional expectations of reality, termed miraculous by the ordinary observer. These phenomena represent the power of the energy field, not that of the individual. One's sense of responsibility for others at this level is of a different quality from that shown at the lower levels. There is a desire to use one's state of consciousness for the benefit of life itself, rather than for particular individuals. This capacity to love many people simultaneously is accompanied by the discovery that the more one loves, the more one can love. Near-death experiences, characteristically transformative in their effect, frequently have allowed people to experience the energy level between 540 and 600.
Energy level 600. Peace.
This energy field is associated with the experience designated by such terms as transcendence, self-realization, and God consciousness. It is extremely rare. When this state is reached, the distinction between subject and object disappears, and there is no specific focal point of perception. Not uncommonly, individuals at this level remove themselves from the world, as the state of bliss that ensues precludes ordinary activity. Some become spiritual teachers, others work anonymously for the betterment of mankind. A few become great geniuses in their respective fields and make major contributions to society. These people are saintly, and may eventually even be designated officially as so, though at this level, formal religion is commonly transcended, to be replaced by the pure spirituality out of which all religion originates. Perception at the level of 600 and above is sometimes reported as occurring in slow motion, suspended in time and space. Though nothing is stationary, all is alive and radiant. Although this world is the same world as seen by others, it has become continuously flowing, evolving in an exquisitely coordinated evolutionary dance, in which significance and source are overwhelming. This awesome revelation takes place non-rationally, so that there is an infinite silence in the mind which has stopped conceptualizing. That which is witnessing and that which is witnessed take on the same identity. The observer dissolves into the landscape and becomes equally the observed. Everything is connected to everything else by a presence whose power is infinite, exquisitely gentle, yet rock-like. Great works of art, music, and architecture, which calibrate between 600 and 700, can transport us temporarily to higher levels of consciousness and are universally recognized as inspirational and timeless.
Energy level 700 to 1000. Enlightenment.
This is the level of the great ones of history who originated the spiritual patterns which multitudes have followed throughout the ages. All are associated with divinity, with which they are often identified. It is the level of powerful inspiration. These beings set in place attractor energy fields which influence all of mankind down through the ages. At this level, there is no longer the experience of an individual personal self as separate from others. Rather, there is an identification of self, with a capital S, with consciousness and divinity. The unmanifest is experienced as self, with the capital S, beyond mind. This transcendence of the ego also serves by example to teach others how this can eventually be accomplished. This is the peak of the evolution of consciousness in the human realm. Great teachings uplift the masses and raise the level of awareness of all of humanity. To have such vision is called grace, and the gift it brings is peace, described as ineffable beyond words. At this level of realization, the sense of one's existence transcends all time and all individuality. There is no longer identification with the physical body as if it were me, and therefore its fate is really of no concern. The body is seen as merely a tool of consciousness. Through the intervention of mind, its prime value, that of communication. The small self merges back into the large self. This is the level of non-duality or complete oneness. There is no localization of consciousness. Awareness is everywhere equally present. Great works of art depicting individuals who have reached the level of enlightenment characteristically show the teacher with a specific hand position called the mudra, wherein the palm of the hand radiates benediction. This is the act of the transmission of this energy field to the consciousness of mankind. This level of divine grace calibrates up to 1000, the highest level attained by any persons who have ever lived in recorded history, to wit, the great avatars, to whom the title Lord is appropriate: Lord Krishna, Lord Buddha, Lord Jesus Christ.